Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. My guest today is Abhinav Chhikara, who's the founder of 10K Designers. Abhinav earlier started and headed the design function at Unacademy, which is, of course, one of the most valued startups in India. We spoke about all things design, the process, the research, being data-driven, collecting feedback, working with overlapping and non-overlapping functions, so on and so forth. We also spoke, more importantly, about what designers should do, what they should not do, the relevance in for a product, for a startup, and other things like the creator economy. This was a wide-ranging conversation. It was quite interactive as well, as Abhinav wanted it to be. And this was fun. I hope you like it. Hey Abhinav, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Roshan, for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it's been a while since we were supposed to do this, but yeah, I'm glad it's finally happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really looking forward to talking to you about all of these things, design and product. And of course, I have to ask like a mandatory question, right? Just for context, and we'll move on from this very quickly, I promise. Just give us a brief about what you're doing right now, and what led to where you are.
For sure. So I'm the founder at 10K Designers. That's my full-time thing that I'm doing right now. 10K Designers is a cohort-based program for UI UX design in specific terms. In broad terms, we're trying to figure out how do we build the strongest design community. The way I got here was I started as a designer back in college, trying to do a lot of freelance work online. As a college kid, I made some money and I was just blown away. I was like, this is what I want to do. But post-college, I continued freelancing and I realized that I didn't know any other designers. Like for me, the community aspect didn't exist. I didn't know a single designer in all of India. And it was probably too early back then. So since then, I worked for a couple companies. I worked at housing.com, went back to doing my own startup, did a music app called Listen, did that for some time. And then I ended up joining Unacademy as one of the early employees. This was about 3.5 years back. I would say I don't remember exactly. But at Unacademy, the best thing that happened was it was so early that I could choose my role. So I was like, okay, Gaurav, I'm going to figure out how to set up the design team. So for 2.5 years, we built the design team. We redesigned every single thing we did. All the platforms, starting from the learner side, educator side, live education. We launched what is today Unacademy Plus. And after spending a good time there, building an amazing team, I was like, okay, it's time for me to get back into startup mode. So here I am. Yeah, and it's been about a year since I've been doing 10K Designers.
Yeah, fantastic. And as I was mentioning before we started recording, you have some of the coolest merch as well, right? Why don't you show off your t-shirt?
Yeah, man. What we do is every single cohort, we get a new t-shirt made and we send this out to all the cohort members, all the mentors and stuff. So these are like limited edition collectibles.
Awesome. So, 10K, from what I understand, is a cohort-based learning / community program, right? How is the community different from, let's say, a Behance or a Dribble or, a bunch of other online communities that exist? And why do you think it's important for Indian designers, I say?
I would say the problem with community, according to me, is when you look at these big platforms, they were one of the first to do it. Dribble, Behance, there's a bunch of them like that. However, as they get bigger, the new members lose out on context. So today, a designer joining Dribble, they're probably not going to make any friends via Dribble. They're going to upload their work. They're going to get 2 followers, 3 followers, similar to Instagram, let's say. Maybe their existing friends who are on Dribble will start following them, but it becomes more like a platform. And so I think the community problem is, how do you create strong context? So the way I'm actually looking at it is, I'm almost thinking about how do I build the strongest alumni network for designers, which is each cohort, a set number of people go through it together. These almost become like your batchmates that you did this experience with. And they end up forming long-term connections. A lot of them today work at the same startup. Some of them have co-founded design agencies together. A lot of them have become collaborators. And that is something that the big networks out there, those communities, have sort of lost out on.
So this is kind of like going to design school in some sense, right? You have a shared context, and then you have these networks that you can kind of leverage for whatever time in the future. So yeah, that sounds
Definitely
pretty interesting. I also want to talk about the Unacademy experience, right? And basis that, I mean, we'll dive a little deeper on the way designers and product folks operate, right? So you did the whole 0 to 1 at Unacademy, and there were plenty of things that involved strategizing on product, right? So typically we see that there's a lot of overlap between design and product, right? I mean, let's say you come up with something and the product person will have a certain opinion about that, and you may ask him to whatever. But how do you hash things out? How do you work with the product folks together?
Yeah. So very interestingly, when I joined, Unacademy had 0 product managers, right? So it was, I think the tech team was maybe around 10 people. Overall, the company was around 40 something people.
Wow.
And for a good year, there were no product managers, right? For the first year of me, there were no product managers. Yeah. And the main reason for that is because as the early team, we were taking a lot of the product decisions. Since it was 0 to 1, as you said, a lot of the patterns hadn't been defined in the industry yet. So an example of that would be, let's say, live streaming as a format. Instagram does live streaming. Twitch does live streaming. Every platform slowly is adding live streaming to it. Twitter has it with Periscope. But then it's different context. One is gaming, one is with your friends, one is maybe something else. The fact is, we were building something which was a very open field, which is it's learning. It can be anything, right? Unlike something like, let's say, e-commerce, but it's a little bit more defined. You're like, okay, there will be a product page. I will click it, which starts the checkout flow. There are some standard things that companies before me have figured out. With learning, it was an open field. So it was 0 to 1. Which is why it was great experience as the design team to figure all this out, because we were just churning out prototypes every single week. We were figuring out how do we create that bridge on which learners and educators meet. That bridge can be asynchronous, which is people watch videos, or it can be synchronous. It can be live. And once it's synchronous, what are some things that this enables that you previously couldn't do with asynchronous? So a lot of these things we were doing were completely design-led. When PMs actually started entering the company, the kind of projects they did were more of optimization projects. So for example, now that there were multiple parallel products running, the PMs were like, okay, I am going to take care of this product. I'm going to be responsible for, let's say, renewals for subscription. And then they would optimize the hell out of that. But during my time there, most of the 0 to 1 stuff, we would do prototypes. Then we would get the PMs involved. Then we would get developers. We would have that conversation. So rather than starting with ideas, we would start with prototypes.
Right. So I don't want to, I don't want to go into a product rant as such. I mean, I believe like in the last 10 or 15 years, I think, one of the key differentiators has been product talent in India, right? I mean, because we've always had engineers, starting with the whole IT services and whatever. But it's the way we've been able to build these products has been a key differentiator. But however, I feel that if you're listening to this podcast, you want to know how to get better. From the hundreds of conversations I've had with some of the best and brightest folks, the one thing I've noticed is that they're all voracious readers. Now that's easier said than done. And that's where the Daily Reader by CTQ Compounds comes in. The Daily Reader is how you can go from a wannabe reader to a regular reader. Every day, you'll get a carefully curated article on a bunch of interesting subjects like machine learning, mental models, or mythology. And you don't just read them, you also get to share learnings and discuss nuances with a community of super interesting people. The Daily Reader is your best way of building a reading habit and, of course, being better. Check out tinyurl.com/want to be a daily reader That's want to be a daily reader, and sign up today for a special discount. I'll link to it in the description. Don't forget to check it out. Differentiator, but however, I feel there's a, there are the excellent, outstanding product folks, and then there's a lot of dead weight. People essentially doing specs and getting different functions to talk to each other in some sense. And in that context, do you think that designers should still report to product folks, or is there some value that you see in that specifically, or do you think that design as a function itself has to be sort of hived off, and it can be another function that can talk to product folks, right? Like, for example, let's say sales or engineering or whatever else.
So I can give you a direct example. My team, I would report to the chief product officer / co-founder, right? So, however, the way I'm sort of thinking about it is, earlier in design, you would have the distinction of UI and UX, right? This guy does visuals, UI, this other person does UX, maybe the research, maybe the, that kind of work. Today, the kind of roles we see are not UI and UX. It's more of product designer or UX researcher. And now the term product designer, technically, in terms of your work, it's a UI / UX designer. That's the term. But a product designer, basically, I like that role, that title so much better, because it's not saying you need to do this, you need to do this. It's saying you need to design the product. How you do that, it could get into, business decisions. It could get into the metrics. It could actually get into the screens, the animations as well. So that way I see that, the direction we're evolving is the boundaries are very blurred. Between, let's say, an APM, PM, product designer. It's a very similar type of work.
An APM is a tester, right?
Yeah, an APM is it's I won't go any further. I don't want to piss off APM.
No, we're just kidding. We're just kidding. So, see, you bring up another very important point, right? Which is going beyond all of these colors and shapes into actually evangelizing the design process as such, right? Now, if you were to actually look at it as holistically as product design, then obviously you'll have to go and get some data in terms of, hey, this is the pain point, and here are some quantitative metrics that define the pain point. And then, before you even actually put finger to key or pen to paper, whatever, right? There's a bunch of things that you have to do, and you have to make very data-driven decisions as well, right? And then there is the fact of, actually iterating on that, collecting feedback in terms of what your users are doing, etc., right? Basically optimizing it further and so on. So, do you feel that, designers often lag behind on those aspects? And if so, what should they do to kind of make it part of their work and process?
Yeah, they definitely do. And I'll tell you the reasons for it also. It's because if you're a designer from design school, the context there is so different, right? Design school is very, very focused on process. In fact, your assignments and your projects in design school, you're not graded on your outcome. You're graded on your process. So imagine entering the industry with that kind of mindset.
Yeah, it's pretty bizarre.
Especially the startup industry. It's bizarre because you're like, hey, I did the perfect process, but why didn't my thing get shipped? It's because, dude, the process doesn't matter if you weren't able to rally towards an outcome. And then that's the case with a lot of self-taught designers who've, learned online through YouTube, through Coursera courses. They've usually worked solo or mostly solo. So when they enter a team, it's almost like, dude, I've been doing all of this by myself, and now there's a dedicated person to do just figuring out retention or just figuring out metrics. So I'm not saying it's something that can't be figured out. Most designers, a few months, few weeks, they get the context and they are able to start running. But the way to overcome this sort of gap is to seek out experiences. It's firstly to be self-aware, to know that this gap exists, right? A lot of people don't realize it till they are in the situation, but then you can seek experiences to fill the gap. So one of the feedback we've seen from our cohorts is we don't have just beginners. We have people who are already designers for 1 or 2 years. We also have people who are transitioning into design from, let's say, sales or a different career. And that 3 months for them, they've said, it's like a crash course almost. I get to feel like I'm on a design team. And all of these invisible context related things I now am able to absorb.
Right. So, okay, on that note, let's talk about your design process, right? So, how do you go about defining the problem, and then what are the n number of steps that are involved until when you actually ship something?
For me, I sort of look at the process as a bit of an inverted pyramid, right? And this is just my mental model of things. The reason it's an inverted pyramid is on the top, you have all your possibilities. When you're starting building out, you're like, the product could go in n number of directions. Each of these is a possible viable path. An example of this is, let's say you're a freelancer and you're speaking to a client. Your first call, you're like, dude, I have no clue what the client is trying to do. Like, it could go in X number of directions. But your job then is to ask questions and make decisions. So what happens is this inverted pyramid, it gets narrower because now the scope of possibilities reduces. You're defining a little bit more clearly what's the goal. And as you do that, you get more clarity. But then in terms of the design process, the way this typically looks is you do a lot of research upfront. You try to understand the problem space, which is what exactly are we trying to do. You try to understand the solution space, which is what do existing solutions look like. From your research, typically you would then get into information architecture, which is you're trying to figure out, okay, we have a profile page. This is what we can include. We can have a page for this. We can have collections, XYZ. Then with your information architecture, then you go to wireframes. But now you're actually getting a little bit more specific. You're taking all this information you have and you're saying, okay, this is how we can arrange it. We can use a list view here. We can use a grid view here. We should use a list because, a person should be able to see 100 items at once. We should use a grid because it's a very visual thing. We want to show let's say the profile picture. So these are the kind of decisions you would make. And then when you keep going deeper, you then get into visual design, where you're trying to convert these wireframes into visuals. You're making a lot of prototypes at this point, which is like simple clickable prototypes, such that somebody, like you can send a link to, let's say, somebody on your team and they can play around with your design, or you can observe them using it. But then, in terms of design process, I would say one place where I've gotten into trouble is when I say this is the design process that I follow, people are like, dude, but what about X? Are you telling me you don't do user interviews? Are you saying you don't do focus groups? Are you saying you don't do some method? And the point is, the way I see it is, design process, there's no one size fits all. It's good to start with the starting framework. Like what I've told you is maybe the initial framework you start with, but then you have to be willing to constantly adjust and course correct based on the kind of project you're doing, based on the company you're in, based on the people you're working with. But yeah, that's how I think about process overall.
Right. Now, one way of doing the research is to go and ask the client, right? And whoever that is, I mean, that could be the customer or the internal person, whoever that is, and to say that, hey, what do you want? And then iterate or converge onto a specific problem statement that the person wants, right? And I don't know if that's the most optimal way of doing it, but oftentimes it happens that when you're doing this research, you realize that the problem statement itself is kind of different, right? It's that classic JTBD problem, right? Jobs to be done problem, basically, right? So does everyone who want to go from A to B need a car, for instance, right? Or is there another way out? And you often have to redefine the problem statement itself. And I was wondering, how do you sell the differentiated problem statement to the stakeholder then in that case? What's that like? Going back to the guy who thought he knew what he wanted, right, with a new proposition on, hey, you know what, actually this is what you should be solving.
Great question, bro. Great question. I would say it starts with asking questions, which is, I think, at the start of a project the main thing that overall you have to do is you have to get on the same page. And what that same page looks like is having enough of a shared context such that later you're like, bro, you didn't tell me about this, or bro, I didn't know that's what you were talking about. So in the beginning, you're trying to find that overlap. You're asking dumb questions, you're asking good questions, you're asking obvious questions, non-obvious questions. But even if
Right.
it's as simple as getting into a room and doing this, um, I think it helps make the shared context. And in the end, I think it's not a matter of one project, it's a matter of n projects, which is the more you work with the same person, the same team, your shared context is going to get so much stronger. Like, you will understand what's going on in the other person's mind without talking about it. So ideally, that's what you want to aim for. You want to work long term with a set of people so that you have enough time to build that shared context.
Right. I guess it's also about expanding each other's sort of understanding of this, right? So, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Whatever. I mean, if you ask each other enough, I think you would cover all the nuances with respect to what we're really trying to solve for, I would say, right? Um, we spoke about being data driven earlier. What are some of the ways you would suggest that people can be data driven? Now, one is obviously you could go and ask a bunch of people, right? Which is, again, I mean, it's a complicated thing. It's not just putting up a survey and giving four choices, right? Because how you ask these questions matters a lot, sometimes more than the question itself, right? And what choices you offer, how you interpret some of this data, and then what you do afterwards, right? So, any
Yes.
thoughts on research, collecting data, how one should look at this?
A very hardcore UX research type of person, but I will tell you how I generally think about it. I think for people who are starting out, the thing they have to do is they have to understand the vocabulary, right? Because if you go after data but you don't have the vocabulary, then you don't know what data is good. So an example of this would be, let's say you don't know what bounce rate is. So then you're describing to somebody what bounce rate you're saying. You're like, bro, can we figure out if people are coming on the website and leaving? And you're thinking maybe it's the number of scrolls that I will calculate. You're thinking maybe it's time spent, but you don't know that there's industry defined terms, right? You could look at bounce rate. You could look at your click through rate. You could look at what the funnel is. What part of the funnel are we at right now? So I'd say for people starting out, it's a good idea to understand the vocabulary and then the frameworks. So for example, just knowing that very likely most parts of your product fall somewhere on a funnel. It could be AARRR, where you're doing acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue. It could mean, let's say, just a checkout flow. But if you don't know that these frameworks exist or what a funnel is, then you'll always be talking about data in very vague terms, and you don't want that. Because if you talk about data in vague terms, you don't know whether the other person is talking about the exact same thing or not. So your 20% might be their 80% because you've defined it so differently. So I think that's the biggest challenge. Yeah.
Right. And okay, just to thread that a little bit, right? I mean, I personally feel we tend to overestimate the quantitative aspects and underestimate the qualitative aspects. So what I mean is, I mean, talking to maybe 20 people may be more beneficial, right? Just an unstructured subjective conversation, right, with someone may be more helpful than sort of looking at some of these funnel metrics, right? Because God knows, I mean, there are enough places to look at these days, right? Half of us marketers are prone to this sort of dashboard porn, if you will, right? So so what do you think about that? I mean, so in terms of actually looking at some of the qualitative aspects, I mean, it's harder to sell, but it could be
Yes.
more useful, right?
Yeah. I would say even at Unacademy, for example, a lot of the stuff we did was qualitative. Um, so I'll give you one example, which is we did this immersion trip where it was me, one of the co-founders, and then we later involved the design and product teams. We went to Delhi. We went to this metro, which was at a major, I think it was an SSC hub. And we spoke to students. We stopped them. We're like, kya apps use karte ho? Like, why are you here? Where do you live? You took the metro. What did you take the metro for? Right? Where do you get your books xeroxed? Like, just random questions. We were trying to just get a mental picture of what does a day in the life of a user look like. And now, of course, when you're doing that, you can't get into quantitative. You can't say, it might not even be useful to say that 50% of our users are from non-metro cities. Like, let's say from that research. Because what you're mostly trying to do is trying to understand who is this person and can I visualize them in high definition in my mind? Can I visualize, what time do they wake up in the morning? What's the first thing they do? If they're using my app, when are they using my app? Is it
Get in their
morning?
shoes,
is it on
basically.
the metro? Yes, get in their shoes. So I think that way designers should be doing more of that actually. The product managers can technically help you out with the quantitative stuff. But these kind of insights, it might be anecdotal, but sharing them widely across your team helps build that context.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed this as well. And marketers are kind of notorious for believing that the customer bought the product for the 3 bullet points that they put in a brochure, right? So and in that very articulate fashion. So if you go and ask them, they almost half expect to hear that, right? But yeah, people do tell you things that you really may not have thought of or would have kind of skipped through, and yeah, those kind of things, right? So what is the strangest thing that someone has said to you, that kind of completely blew your mind? It could be some feedback or something of that sort.
I'll tell you a few that stood out, and then I'll try to figure out which is the stranger one. Our hypothesis going into this was people are going to using WhatsApp a lot, right? Our hypothesis was learners are using WhatsApp. They have WhatsApp groups. They're sharing PDFs. They're doing all of this stuff. On ground, we saw very little of that. We realized it's way more competitive. It's not collaborative. Like, the reason we had that assumption is because building products is a little bit more collaborative than competitive. But when we actually went there, people didn't have these kind of WhatsApp groups. They didn't have these study networks or anything. Right? So that was a good lesson in questioning your assumption and stating them rather than just invisibly letting it bias you.
Interesting.
Another one was just a lot of the people we spoke to were just not users, in the sense that somebody, for example, who was attempting the exam for the third time said, dude, I use 0 apps, because if it's my third attempt or even second attempt, I know exactly the gaps that I have that I need to fill, and I'm studying just that. And I have 0 apps. I go to 0 classes. I just have me and my textbook, and this is what I'm doing. So that was interesting, because our mental this thing was we're bundling learners or aspirants into one group. But then we're like, hey, it's actually way more specific than that. There are some people that just will not use the product because they have no need for it. And it might change later. We might have a more differentiated offer for them. But that kind of exclusion kind of helped. Yeah.
Interesting. So when you look at these different cohorts of users, right? Someone who likes X and someone who likes Y and someone who, whatever, right? There may be like God knows how many, right? Multiple of these cohorts and whatnot. How do you generalize from this and abstract a general set of features or decisions to kind of suit everybody's context?
Good question, man. I don't have a very solid answer. The simple answer is just to do it on the fly and figure it out, and just course correct often. But in the design world, there is a method for this. It's called user personas. But however, I think personas are also, it's a method. It is limiting if you stick too closely to your personas. So So for example, when we did this immersion trip I was just talking about, our two personas became first time exam writers, first time attempts, and people who are doing more than one. And we realized for more than one, like we shouldn't, for example, build features that are more than one because it seems like the minority. Right now, we might be proved wrong later, but it seems like the minority. So then for the next 6 months or whatever, most of our decisions became, okay, let's do it for these people. But then today, for example, I'm sure that has changed again. So as you do new research with new insights, you have to keep updating your mental models. So the last thing you want is a mental model that worked yesterday, but today is not relevant.
Got it. So, do you see, and this is on a tangent, right? I mean, do you see brand design and UX sort of collapsing into one? I mean, I mentioned about your merch, right? Like pretty cool stuff. I kind of see one flowing into the other in some sense, right? So, what do you make of that?
Yeah, the reason I do it is because to me it's experience design. I know that this will create a really good experience for every one of my alumni to have this t-shirt, and then you're sitting at Starbucks and you see somebody else with the t-shirt, or you see somebody from the previous cohort and you're like, dude, I recognize that. So me, that's a part of the experience. But dude, what you touched upon is actually a great point, which is we sort of, the old view is to look at it as graphic designer, motion designer, illustrator,
Yeah, precisely.
somebody who does ads, somebody who does branding, somebody who does performance marketing versus brand marketing. But I think the direction we're moving seems to be that a lot of companies are looking for generalist storytellers. They're like, dude, tell my story, talk about my values, talk about my products. You want to do it through tweets, you want to do it through YouTube videos, you want to do it through creating a member kit, and that becomes it's an interesting role. It's not for everyone, of course, right? Not everybody is comfortable in a generalist role like that. But I think we're going to see more companies hiring just like generalist creatives whose job is just to be create that public narrative through multiple mediums.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting point, right? Because, like, let's say, I mean, you're a designer tagged to a marketing team. You don't get to complete that experience unless you have some say in the product, or unless you're collaborative on that front also, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and really the medium is part of the problem statement in some sense. I mean, right, if you have like a panel on LinkedIn versus, let's say, I mean, you have a huge ass banner somewhere on in an event versus it's like a video that's playing in a moving car, right? So these are, I mean, it defines the problem statement in some sense. So, I mean, I have to ask you this. So, what are some of your favorite apps and why?
My favorite apps right now, I use Apple Notes a lot to write stuff. I'm making lists all the time for some reason. I try to do, every call that I do, I make notes on that. So Apple Notes and Calendar are the most used for me. Besides that, switched to Superhuman recently for email, mostly because my volume of email was increasing, and kind of getting used to that. It's quite good. But besides that, I would say actually, maybe another way I can put it is top 5 apps. Top 5, because if I start counting, I did this once. I was thinking about how many apps do I use on a regular basis, and the number and I started counting on my fingers, and I reached 21, and I was like, okay, let me just stop.
Wow.
Because there are these very specific apps. So for example, for running the cohort, I use this one app which is just not an app but a SaaS, which is just for sending reminder emails for session is about to start. Right, so that way the stack that I use is huge. But my top apps, I would say Apple Notes, Calendar, Superhuman. I use Notion a lot, but mostly, again, that's a similar use case to Apple Notes, just for making notes. Twitter for me is like if I look at my phone and I'm like, time spent last week, Twitter's going to be number one. And I think it sounds weird because I saw this tweet recently, which is, as a founder, Twitter is the worst and best use of your time. Worst
Yeah.
because it's so unpredictable. You have no clue what you might get pulled into, and it might fuck up the rest of your day. But then it's the best investment because most of my collaborators, like even Gaurav for Unacademy, we met on Twitter. My back then girlfriend, now wife, we met on Twitter, right? Most of the hires I've made for Unacademy and even here, we met on Twitter. So Twitter for me is like up there of the top apps that I use.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think Twitter is perhaps the one app that creates the most amount of serendipity, right? So people that you may not normally intersect with, but somehow intersect with, a content that you may not normally consume, but somehow end up looking at it and so on. So
Yes.
yeah, it's a very interesting sort of a medium, I would say. And if you sort of like, stay away from all of the really base level stuff of outrage and shit like that, I think it could actually be I would say it could be super productive also in some sense, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
but
have
keeping
to use
away is so
block
hard.
lists. Yeah, have to use blocks, have to use mute
Yeah,
keywords. If you're like
yeah,
not into sports, politics, celebrities, whatever that dominant thing that might be eating up your timeline. Like, yeah, you have to like
yeah.
really put in the work.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I think I realized this probably about 3 or 4 years back when I really started curating my feed, and since then, I mean, it's just been amazing, you know. Um, this whole consumerization of SaaS, right? SaaS software, or the way B2B software in general has become so sexy right now, right? I mean, earlier these were really like terrible, right? And I remember from 13 years back, some of this stuff was like such an eyesore. I mean, it was horrendous, right? It was
Yeah.
basically moving Excel sheets in some sense, you know. Compare that to where we are right now, right? Where there's just not much of differentiation, and colors are brighter, whatever, and it's a lot more intuitive. It's a lot more gamified. People actually care that you're using it or not, right? Not just that you're mandated to it. What do you think about this?
I mean, it's a very, very, very dominant trend. Um, One example that I used to think about this is, in design, you've got InVision, which is super funded. I think their goal is to be the next Adobe. Very heavy on enterprise sales, for example. They sell to huge Fortune 100 companies, 500 companies in the US. Now, their approach has been sales. It's been enterprise sales. They go to this thing and they say, you're the CPO at Verizon. We'll help you figure out your design systems. We integrate, help you figure out process, all of that stuff as well. And then now they have an enterprise contract. And then with that, they can then go to AT&T and say, this is what Verizon does. We won't, of course, share the data, but we'll help you figure out your process. Now compare that to something like Figma. Figma is so community led. It's bottom up rather than top down. So, and it's I think it's not even about when we think of consumerization of SaaS, we think of Slack, which looks really good. We think
Yeah.
about these illustrations that companies use, the bright colors. But more than that, I think what we're seeing is the communityfication of enterprise, which is rather than
Collaboration.
these top down
Yeah.
collaboration. Yes.
Yeah.
Rather than top down decisions saying companies saying you need to use this, bottom up teams are like, we will use Figma because it's the best design tool. So I think because of that, now the narrative is changing. So instead of companies being like very plain, their websites are talking about a Gartner score or whatever, they're like, let's make this fun, because we're not speaking to the CXO, we're speaking to the users directly. So I think that has
Yeah.
led to the consumerization.
Yeah, a lot of this is credited to Slack actually. I mean, I think Slack is one of the first major applications that really, I mean, you felt like using as a business user,
Mm,
you know. And earlier, I think it was, I don't know if it was on purpose. I mean, the application was sort of made to look intimidating, right? As if to show off the complexity that, we
yeah.
could handled so many of these things, or I can give you 500 fields that you can look at, or I mean, here is a maze, just go figure out which way is the most optimum to go about it, right? Yeah, it's pretty
Mm,
interesting. So yeah, so in that sense, I mean, a lot of things are also converging, right? In terms of specializing in, hey, what is it that you kind of design itself, right? I mean, you could be designing for in the edtech sector for one instance, and then you could be designing somewhere else. It's just that the
yeah.
problem statement changes, the context changes, and you have to be mindful of that.
True. In fact, even for 10K designers, in a lot of my messaging, I am now starting to play with, rather than just saying UI UX designer or designer, I'm saying creative career, which is a creative career is one where you are firstly creating whatever your medium might be. Technically, development is a creative career. It's just that your medium of expression is code. It could be screens, it could be graphics, it could be stories that you tell online, it could be marketing. But I think that kind of term, creative career, uh, it focuses on the big picture. It says that, hey, there is a need for people out there who can take problems that are thrown at them that nobody has solved in our company before. It's a fresh 0 to 1 problem, and they can use their creative process or design process to come up with a solution, productize or systematize it, and then work on the next problem. Like these kind of creative career, I don't know what to call them. I don't know if it's a designer, product manager, product marketer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely these roles are collapsing, right? I mean, so when I think about what I do as well, and I had marketing for a SaaS company called Vimo, right?
Mm,
A lot of it is trying to get the context of what the customer is thinking, right? Or what his or her daily life is essentially, and
mm,
then mapping it to the product. Because very early on, so Vimo was my initiation into SaaS. Very early on,
mm,
what I realized was nobody gives a damn about your features, right?
mm,
You could have the most cutting edge stuff that that anyone has in the industry, but nobody really cares.
mm,
They really care about what your product or features can do for them, right? And typically, when I get on a demo, and I was just doing this, based on the last 3 or 4 demos, right? I barely show about 30% of the features,
mm,
right, of the 100% or whatever we have, right? Because it's really not about that. It's really about focusing on the customer essentially, and building around that, so you are almost like a medium in that sense. So
true.
from that perspective, I do see a lot of these roles kind of collapsing. The tools and the end outcomes that we might be like sort of responsible for, or accountable for, I think may define where we belong, right? So if you
Mm,
go through the process and come up with an interface, you are probably a designer, and if I go through the process and come up with a campaign, I'm probably a marketer, right? So
yes.
yeah, I guess, I mean, there's a lot of shared context in some sense. it'll be
Mm,
it'll be kind of, and I mean, on that note, how do you think designers should sort of overlap with all of these other functions? I mean, typically,
mm,
designers overlap with developers and product folks and whatever. But for instance, customer success, right? Or support. So how do you think designers could potentially overlap with these kind of functions?
mm. I'm not so sure. I, I think I think the obvious way seems to be that firstly you need to understand why that function is important. Right? Most designers might not even know what X role does. So understanding that this is what they do and this is how it fits into the larger puzzle. Because I think with design, it's easy to miss out on this fact sometimes, which is you
Yeah.
might make your screens But in the end, the developers have to develop it into a real product. The testers have to test it out. It needs to, there's a bunch of other parts as well. Your design is not the final thing that a user will use.
Yeah.
So it's almost like understanding what this conveyor belt sort of looks like. What's the entire product cycle? And then understanding your place within it.
Yeah.
So that kind of holistic view, I'm not sure what's the best way to get it, but I think that's what is needed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. In some sense, I mean, you have to understand the customer, understand the business even before you understand like your whatever it is that you have to do, right? Because I think it's very easy to get siloed, I would say, especially in growing teams, and when you're working in such a fast-paced environment, right? I mean, you just could very easily ship, and not really care about what else is happening. It might be impossible to sort of abstract yourself away from whatever it is that you have to deliver today, and look at the big picture, but really looking at all of the pieces in totality, yeah, does a world of good for your perspective, I feel. Because
True.
I don't know if you do this. I mean, oftentimes when you're like very neck deep into a problem, like let's say, I mean, you have to pick some interfaces or whatever, and you've seen a bunch of these palettes. I mean, suddenly it all starts looking the same, right? You have to kind of move away from that. I mean, do something else, come back and look at things, I think. I mean, which is also, yeah,
that
go on.
alone is a very valuable skill. The ability to zoom in and zoom out as
Yeah,
much as you would like.
yeah,
Not everybody can do that.
yeah, yeah. And I think most people get the best ideas away from the desk, you know? Yeah, like I get my
Definitely.
best ideas in the gym, or when I'm just out on a walk or whatever it is. So
Definitely.
let's talk about 10K again, 10K designers again, right? So for a bit, how do you think about the curriculum? Like, I mean, sure, there are design schools out there, and sure, there are courses out there, and whatever. Now, from everything that we've discussed, for this new designer, right, designer of 2021, and who will hopefully be relevant 30 years from now, let's say, right, or 40 years from now, how do you think about the curriculum, and what principles went into that?
Yeah. So to start off, I definitely looked at existing courses. I looked at what traditional colleges have. But my goal was never to take all of that and fit it into 3 months. Right? 3 months is the duration we do. It's never to that, I need to do 100% coverage of what you would learn in a design school or what you would learn somewhere else. This thing was take whatever you can from that, but more than the content itself, it's the kind of habits that you're building in people. So an example of that would be most of this content is available online, but you have no context for it because you either don't know what the words are, so you can't Google it, or after you Google it, you see 100 results and you're like, I don't know what, it seems to be conflicting opinions. So along with content, you need context. And I think having this cohort based program where you have mentors as part of this, you have your peers as part of this, peers come from diverse backgrounds, you have me, you have all the people who do the teaching, so that you have content, which is the core of it, but then you have context, and the way this context can live is in the community. So you being a part of the community, which is, for example, this 3-month community, after which you become an alumni, this 3-month community is going to be almost like an event, almost like a 3-month conference where all this context is held, absorbed, and then exchanged.
Interesting. So on that note, what would your advice be for any designers who are listening to the podcast? I mean, aside from, of course, joining the 10K designers community, right? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, I mean, one of my it's one of my catchphrases now, I guess, internally. But one of the things I say is make friends, not bookmarks. And what I mean by that is my approach to learning when I started out was, bro, let's find the best content out there and let's absorb all of it. Let's read the textbooks, let's watch the videos, let's do the Coursera, everything. But that can only get you so far, because let's be honest, most jobs are not even publicly posted. They get closed as soon as you talk about them, either through a referral or somebody who you were already in conversation with, right?
Yeah. In
And
fact, I think the coolest jobs don't exist. They just get created.
yeah, yeah,
You know?
definitely. So if that's the problem, then of course, the college model is not going to work, because the college model assumes we're training you for this job that exists at the end of the tunnel. But more than so coming back to make friends, not bookmarks, your goal as a designer is not just to learn the stuff, but it's also to build your network. Because together you might be able to learn this much, but together doing it as a multiplayer activity, you can learn a lot more. So how do you form that kind of squad, that kind of gang? For us, it's the cohort. For you, it might be, a team that you build, that you end up saying, we should do a startup together. So it's like, how do you form these squads, these people that you can do it together with?
So how do you collaborate with other designers? So, I mean, I've always believed you should have strong convictions and strong principles, but loosely held, right? I heard it somewhere, and I thought it was pretty cool. You should definitely believe in something and not be like very blasé about it, like 50-50 here, there, whatever. But be willing to change your mind and opinion based on, let's say, new information. So how do you collaborate as a designer? So you share something with someone and the person says, hey, you know what, this is not right, or
Yeah.
or have you thought of this other thing? And then now you have to kind of revisit the whole thing, right? Or you have the other task of explaining to them again, and stress testing your design in some sense.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I mean, I wouldn't say
Yeah.
it's an easy thing to do. So any advice
The
on
way,
being
yeah.
collaborative?
There's multiple ways you can do it. So within our cohorts, for example, we have an assignment type of model where we have a very real assignment brief, very real problem statement. And you work on it together or with a team. And then the mentors are responsible for giving you feedback and helping you course correct. But in a team, let's say you end up joining a company, you would be doing this kind of collaboration with your teammates. But then online, if you're like a self-taught designer, the good news is that you don't really need developers to launch products anymore. Like, that scope is increasing, right? A lot of stuff can be no code. Or even if you're not building a product, you can
Yeah.
actually build media properties like you and I are doing, right? With podcast, with YouTube. And that can give you leverage. So in that sense, then you can collaborate on these projects. You can collaborate on, let's say you do a podcast with someone, it's just conversations, and maybe it's useful to someone else. You could also, start an agency together, which is you're saying, hey, I'm doing some freelance projects, and every once in a while I have more projects than I know what to do with. You want to do this together. So what this does is this, whatever type of collaboration it is, it sows these seeds of trust. So you worked on projects together, now you can trust this person, and now you can aim for even bigger things.
Yeah. And over a period of time, I guess you can like find people who kind of complement you, right? As in, I mean,
Yeah,
you don't have to be great
definitely.
about everything. Uh, you have these people kind of bridging those differences, and actually, in it's a classic case of 1 plus 1 not equal to 2, right? I mean, it's a lot more when that happens, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So, you mentioned no code, and that flows quite neatly into this, which is this whole creator economy, right? In some sense, I mean, you are one of the more notable faces in India on that front, right? You spoke in the Maker Summit recently also. What do you make of this creative economy? Is it like a fancier term for freelancing, or I mean, I think, are we at this cultural movement like a zeitgeist where the stack is there in terms of tools and technologies, and
Yeah.
people are also sort of open to it with remote and whatnot, and a bunch of these sort of trends converging to form this?
I mean, the way I think about it is when I was doing design back in the day, which is maybe around 2011, 2013, around that time, I had only two options as a designer. One was join a company, and the second was freelance. Only two options. Other options means you're not a designer. You're getting into something else. So these were the only two options that most designers had. But if you look at both these options, they're examples of selling time, which is a company is saying we are going to buy this bundle of time, full time. You work 40 hours a week, 160 hours in the month. We pay you your salary and stay here for as long as you want. With freelance, you're saying I'm buying smaller bundles, like I'll work on a project 10 hours a week, and then you pay me for a project basis, hourly basis, whatever. But again, both of these are examples of selling time. And the biggest problem with selling time is we don't have an infinite amount of it. We have very limited time, right? This is, I don't know, last 2-3 conversations I've had like these, I've quoted Nawal saying, you're not going to get rich selling your time. You have to own assets. So I think with creator economy, the big picture is we're seeing that a lot of these creators are figuring out, instead of selling my time like this as jobs, how can I create a product that I can sell, which is an output of my time? It's a product of my time. So, I would never be able to sell, let's say, 6,000 hours of time because I don't have 6,000 hours in a month. But now I can spend 200 hours, put it towards this product. It doesn't even need to be a product. It could be a podcast. It could be a YouTube, this thing.
Could be an NFT, yeah?
It could be NFT. It could be a course. But it's a product of your time. And now this can scale, which is while you're sleeping, 100 people can watch your thoughts. You can watch your ideas. Or, that's the video example. Or they can consume your art. Or they can, use your product. So what we're seeing is now creators are directly creating products rather than creating it for a company who is creating products. And of course, the tools have definitely helped with that, the tool stacks.
So it's a shift in mindset towards a more of a product-centric approach to things, right?
Yeah.
But it also imposes a lot of challenges in terms of putting yourself out there, right? Because I do know people who are like, not the most extroverted types, right? Who don't really like to talk to the world so much as such. So how should those people look at this?
The good news is that we're slowly shifting to a point where it's not about the size of your audience anymore. Which is, if you were doing this 5 or 10 years earlier, you would probably start with a website, you would optimize the SEO, you would do blog posts, and then you would hope that your traffic grows huge so you can earn money through ads. But now, even if you have an audience size of just 100 people and these people are your super fans, they will buy a product. They will want closer access to you. They trust you because you've been, showing up. So I'm seeing, I don't know what this means overall, but I think that shift, which is it's not about the size, will get a lot of introverts into the space as well. Because then it's like, I'm not trying to optimize. I'm not trying to become an influencer or a public figure. I'm just trying to tell my story to the people who are interested. And eventually that can get to a point where that is maybe your part-time income, eventually your full-time income.
Interesting. So, all right, man, this has been a fun conversation, really. One of the more interesting conversations I've had in a while. Thank you again. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And for all of you listening, definitely follow Abhinav on Twitter, right? One of the more interesting people to follow on Twitter.
Thank you, bro.
Right? So before you leave, Abhinav, any closing thoughts, anything you want to plug?
Man, I would say, Roshan, killer job with this. I've been following the podcast for a while now, and I think what you're doing that is kind of rare is that even though you come from a marketing kind of background, you're able to connect into so many different fields, right? So the kind of conversations you're having, that is the most interesting thing to me.
Thanks so much.
But yeah, for everybody, yeah, man. But for everybody else, I don't have anything to plug. I would say if you're considering becoming a designer, I have a lot of free content on YouTube. So that might get you some momentum to get started. Of course, the cohorts, we do, I think, maybe 2 or 3 cohorts every year. So I actually try not to plug it because,
you're getting more applications than you can handle, right?
I'm getting more applications than I can handle, for sure. So I just tell people, follow on Twitter. I'll share my ideas. I'll share my videos there. And that's,
Yeah. So definitely follow the person and then the product will follow later. So
yeah, yes.
All right. On that note, thank you again. And we'll end things here. Hopefully we'll talk soon.
Yep, definitely. See you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.